Are you perfect? All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Michelle Schuler. I'm the co-chair of IFMA Boston's Think Tank Committee. Thank you for joining us today for a discussion on leases and why understanding them is so important. Before I jump into formal introductions, I'd like to mention that if you're an FM and are interested in helping shape the content and programs that IFMA Boston offers, we ask that you join us for our upcoming open mic night on March 26th. This is an annual event where our FM groups and annual partners discuss all things FM and the topics they would like to see covered in the coming year. Registration will be open shortly. I think it's already open, isn't it, Gio?
No, I haven't opened it because I'm waiting on some info,
Oh,
but
okay.
I've sent it out to our internal leadership so that they
Good.
can keep it on their
Perfect.
calendars.
Okay, so it is opening shortly. The mission of IFMA Boston is to provide a full range of programming throughout the year, including publications, training opportunities, webinars, networking, and special events for facilities managers and those who support the built environment in the Boston area. We appreciate you choosing to spend your time with us today. Now, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Robb LaBossiere, who also happens to be my co-chair here on the Think Tank. Rob has spent more than 25 years in the commercial real estate industry, taking on roles on construction, engineering, leasing, property, and facility management. Over the course of his career, he's worked with several major local and regional organizations, including Turner Construction, Properties, and American Tower. He now serves at BXP, which was Boston Properties, as a senior property manager, where he manages over 1 million square feet of life sciences space for a genetic research institute in Kendall Square, Cambridge. Rob is an active member of IFMA Boston, and as I mentioned, also serves as a co-chair of the Think Tank Committee. He also holds a BA in political science from Boston College. And I'd like to turn it over to Rob. Thank you so much for doing this, Rob.
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So, yeah, welcome. We're going to dive into something that every FM touches on, but maybe doesn't feel comfortable with, and that's the lease. Do want to say, start. I've been on the landlord side. I've been on the tenant side. I've been a third party manager on the tenant side, third party manager on on both the landlord and tenant side. I'm not an attorney. And I did not stay at a Holiday Inn last night. But I think as we move into this, you'll see I do have some experience. And I think sometimes I know what I'm talking about. My wife disagrees sometimes with that, but you can think of the lease as the rule book for how your building should actually always run. My goal today is to translate some of this into everyday FM language so you can walk away being confident and not overwhelmed with the lease. So the leases shape almost everything we do, from budgets to service level agreements that we have with both the landlords and the vendors that we work with. The leases impact daily FM operations, budget, risk management, making them critical to understand. Uh, Understanding the lease terms helps prevent costly errors such as misclassifying capital replacements or repairs. And mastering the lease basics empowers the FMs to anticipate issues and protect organizational resources effectively. Understanding the basics helps us avoid those financial surprises and run our space more smoothly and keep our CEOs and CFOs happy. Um, so today what we're going to aim for is a few things. So we're going to look at the different types of leases that are out there so you know what financial model you're working within. Then we'll walk through how to navigate a lease without feeling like you need a law degree. We'll then look at the key operational obligations that are hidden inside the document and why they may matter. And finally, we'll talk about what can go wrong if you don't catch some of these clauses early. And why does this matter to the FM? The lease is the master rule book for the building. It dictates what you should do as a tenant. And also what the landlord should be doing for the tenant, because this really is a two-way street. The lease is providing those guideposts for both parties, and it's the FM's role to ensure operational compliance to prevent any potential costs and disputes. And the slides are going through, right? You got that there? Yes, great. So let's first break down the main types of leases that there are, because this affects what everyone's responsibilities are. So the first is no particular order, it's referred to as a triple net lease. The tenant is responsible for all operating expenses. This includes the taxes, insurance, utilities, maintenance, and repairs. From an FM perspective, this means that you should pay close attention to budgeting and service contracts because the tenant is financially responsible for the building's operating costs. Uh, in this case, it could be that you directly contract and manage all the vendors that are servicing the building, or it could be that the landlord is managing those vendors and is then billing a monthly escrow along with the rent. Then at the end of the year, there'd be a reconciliation to true up what you paid in escrows versus what the actual operating costs were or operating expenses were for the building. In the gross lease, the operating expenses are bundled into the rent. The tenant's costs are more predictable in that case. It's whatever the monthly rent is, that's what you pay. But the FM needs to understand what service levels the landlord is obligated to provide. It's important to confirm what's covered under the landlord's responsibilities and what's under your responsibilities to avoid unexpected gaps in services. And then the last one is referred to as a modified gross lease. So this is a bit of a hybrid where some of the expenses could be included in the rent, while others, like utilities, as an example, are passed through to the tenant. These terms vary widely, so FMs should understand and read the sections carefully to understand which obligation you're under. And and this can come in so with the with the modified gross, one of the other nuances of it is the expenses can be calculated based on a base year. So in that scenario, in the modified gross, the lease is structured so that the tenant pays for increases above the base operating year. So if in year one, as an example, the operating expenses were, say, $100,000, and then in year two, the operating expenses go up to $110,000, you as the tenant would then be responsible for the delta, the $10,000 difference. And it goes up every year from there. So the landlord will provide a reconciliation statement at the end of the year. It generally comes in March, right? If you're working on the calendar year, they need some time to close their books. So from a time frame, that's generally when you can expect those. But it makes it important to review those statements to make sure that the landlord is not indeed passing costs on to you that are unjust. And so what I'd say is the individual landlords may use terms that don't exactly reflect how the lease functions. So yes, I'm saying triple net and gross lease and modified gross. You might hear someone say a single net lease or a double net lease. It doesn't matter at the end of the day. What is really most important is that you read your lease to understand what expenses you are responsible for and what repairs and maintenance and operating your expenses what you're responsible for. But where you can find some of this information is in the table of contents, and that brings us to the next slide. So I know this is a bit of an eye chart here, but I think it's important. Really does show you all of the different facets of the lease. And as some of you may know, I mean, leases can range from 5 pages to 150, 250 pages, right? Depending on the landlord, depending on the scenario. But generally speaking, everything that's on this slide will be incorporated in some way or somehow into the lease. So, just going through this real quickly, your rent is going to be stated, what your security deposit is going to be stated, permitted uses, right? Which is kind of important. You may be thinking you're an office user that has an R&D lab. Where maybe your lease doesn't take into account what you're doing in your R&D lab. So all that kind of stuff is detailed in the basic lease information. There'll be a definition of the premises and the common areas. the length of the lease, when you can have access to the space, right? Because it's not always necessarily when rent starts. There'll be a section about the rent and what's included in the rent. So you'll have your base rent, you'll have your operating expenses, taxes, utilities. So all that be called out in a particular section. Again, back to how you can be using the space, how you shouldn't be using the space. Um, and also hazardous materials. Again, another thing that where it's important to have clarity between the tenant and the landlord, because something that may be kind of standard operating procedures for you and your business, may be something that the landlord is not entirely expecting to be in their space. So it's important things like that are at least identified there. Um, if you're doing any work in the space, who's doing it, what are the conditions around doing that work, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Who's doing maintenance and repairs? There will always be sections about insurance and indemnification and liability. And what I can say to that is, there are attorneys that spend their entire lives working on those two sections. You're It's important to be aware of those sections as an FM, but when you start to get into those sections, really, those are probably areas where you would want to lean on others in your organization to really help you out, to make sure that nothing is being done that cause an issue. I think the certificates of insurance, I think we all deal with those as on the FM side. So whatever the parameters are for those certificates of insurance, that's where you'd find that information. To the extent a space is going to be sublet, if you're taking more and you're going to bring in another tenant, the rules and regulations are there. Landlord default. If a landlord's not making repairs, say to a repeated roof leak, it may be up to others in your organization to decide on how to remedy it, but it's really up to the FM to be documenting those issues, whether it be in a work order system or a CMMS, or even just saving emails, so that if and when your CFO or director of real estate, whoever it may be, goes to the landlord to look for compensation, that you've done your piece to at least do the documentation. And then there's some other things, condemnation. Again, if there's a catastrophic event, a fire, a flood, what happens in those cases. Building rules and regulations, also something we'll get into a little bit later. Estoppel certificates and subordination. Again, kind of some of the technical nitty-gritty pieces of a lease. Probably not things that FMs would necessarily get into, but you'll see that. Entry by the landlord, something you might be involved with, right? The landlords do have a right to come in, or will have some certain set of rights to come in. It might be helpful for you to know what those are, right? If you're healthcare, you might have HIPAA regulations, a lab. You're going to have all kinds of other regulations about who can and can enter and under what circumstances. And then there is a miscellaneous section, which will have a whole bunch of different things. Again, how much the brokers are getting paid, and see how rich they're getting when they did your deal, and some other information. So in general, that's the table of contents. Again, there'll be variation. Every lease is different. There'll be some variation, but those are kind of the general buckets. There are some areas though that we're going to focus on here, and I've highlighted them as accordingly. Um, so operating expenses, what do you do? So that's in the yellow there in the rent section. What do you pay for versus what does the landlord pay for, right? So we'll talk a little bit about that and delineating that. Then you'll have the landlord responsibilities and the tenant responsibilities. So who is responsible for doing the things that are being paid for, right? So the one is about the money side, the other one is about who is actually doing the work. But there are a few areas of risk that can have serious financial implications, and those I've highlighted in red. So common areas. I highlight that because that is defined in the lease. Sometimes it's a little might be a little difficult to understand what it is, but it's important that you understand where your space starts and stops, and where the landlord space stops and starts, because not knowing where that line is can really lead to some meaningful issues down the road. Holdover. I don't know. I mean, in my world and my experience, this is a really one of the bigger areas where FM can really cause issues for the company, really kind of unmitigated expenses for the company if you're not paying attention to this. But these are the costs that are associated with staying in a space after your lease is terminated. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but I just can't stress enough the importance of being aware of the holdover. Alterations, right? What space is yours? Again, this gets back to touches on common area a little bit, but what space is yours, and what do you have to do if you want to make changes in a space? And I would say it shouldn't even be if, when, right? I mean, it's extremely rare that you move into a space and over the course of a 5, 10, 20-year lease, you're not making changes at some point. Removal and restoration. So again, if you are making changes in the space, you are making those alterations, what do you need to do at the end with all of those changes, right? And then that does tie to the holdover. So it's really important that you understand what you need to do at the end of the lease. And then the last one I've got are the building rules. It's kind of I've always found this kind of interesting because this is it's noted in a lease, but it's like this whole separate document that kind of lives outside the lease, which a landlord generally can change at will. Now, they're not going to be able to change things like your rent or your premises, but I mean, we'll talk a little bit more about it, but it is something you want to pay attention to. So let's jump in here. So operating expenses. This is one of the most important areas for FM because it affects the money and the compliance with the lease. When we talk about the OpEx, we're talking about the costs required to keep the building running day to day. So what's typically included? Janitorial, trash and recycling, landscaping, snow removal, security, pest control, utilities for common area, whether it's electricity, gas, for central systems, etc. And routine maintenance like HVAC maintenance, elevators, fire life safety inspections, and perhaps BMS support for controls for the building. Insurance premiums and property taxes are also part of the OpEx budget. Generally speaking, insurance may get locked into OpEx. Property taxes are generally usually pretty well defined separately from the OpEx, but they still do fall into the OpEx budget. What's not included are capital expenditures, so things like major HVAC replacements or roof replacements, repaving parking lots or other structural repairs. Also, landlords will have business costs like legal fees, debt service, income taxes, commissions, and marketing. Also, cosmetic upgrades like lobby remodels or amenity build-outs shouldn't be passed through to the tenant. And definitely no penalties or late fees or charges due to landlord negligence, right? If they've got bank fees or additional fees because they didn't pay the utility bill on time, those should not be passed on to the tenants. And so your role as an FM is to really kind of track and question and validate those expenses, which again you will see, and you do have the right to look at. So you want to look closely at things like repair and replacement, right? Did the landlord just replace one failed VFD? Or are they going ahead and like on a major upgrade and replacing all 40 VFDs that are in the building as some sort of capital program? So you want to be aware and cognizant of things like that. You're going to want to monitor utility usage, right? And compare year to year trends, even things like that. Right? Are the parking lot lights turning off during the day, or are they on all the time? Because at the end of the day, you're very likely those costs are being passed on to you, and you do have the opportunity to audit. So that is a clause that is within the lease. There'll always be an audit clause. They will give you a limited window of time to review those. And typically speaking, you'll have to do this with the landlord. The landlord will give you a very dimly lit conference room that has no windows in the basement of the building, and there'll be limited HVAC, and they'll have a stack of boxes, and it'll be incumbent upon you and your team to go through receipts and invoices to ensure that the questions you're asking, the proof that you want, that the expenses are justified are there. So that is the audit rate is an obligation that the landlord has to provide you with information, but it's your responsibility to then go get that and identify the information that you want. I do joke a little bit about being in the windowless conference room, but that kind of the landlord's not going to be happy about having you on site to go through all of their invoices and receipts, so they're not going to make it a pleasant experience. So now jump into the repairs and maintenance. So this is where kind of the demising line between your premises and the common area matters. Talks about who fixes what. So the landlord usually handles the heavy stuff like the structure and the main systems. The tenants handle the interior and anything they install. Many leases will require first-class preventative maintenance, which means you need to keep good documentation. So at the end of the lease, if you're responsible for maintaining the fan quality units, VAVs, what have you, that it's important that you've got evidence that your HVAC contractor, or if you have an in-house facilities team, that you've got all that documented in your CMMS, so that at the end of the lease you can hand that over to the landlord and say, "Yep, I've done my monthlies, I've done my quarterlies, my semi-annuals, etc." Um, the um, the preventive maintenance, and then end of term obligations. So the requirements for how you turn the space over at the end, making sure you understand what broom clean means, to the extent that that word is used in the lease. But you'll want to understand that, and those will be found in the surrender and the restoration clauses. And so it's an obligation to remove or leave tenant improvements. All right, so that's again one of the important things. We'll talk a little bit more about it when you're doing work, whether you're putting up walls, completely reconfiguring things, whatever the case may be. Having a clear understanding as to what should be staying and what should be going at the end of the lease. So some compliance and legal considerations. So I mentioned the building rules. You'll find out how in that you'll find out how the buildings are supposed to operate in terms of things like when and where deliveries are supposed to go, whether or not you need to use elevator pads in the elevators, what are the hours that you can be moving in and out of the building. There's a whole host of other things that are found there, but those are some of the things that you'll find there. And so again, if you're moving into the building and you don't use elevator pads, and you ding up the wall and in the building rules and regs, it says you need to use elevator pads. Well, now the landlord is, opportunity to come to you looking for restoration of the elevator to the extent you damaged it. The alterations improve. So yeah, talking about the alterations and improvements. So anything that you do in the space is going to require, or should require, permission from the landlord. You will need to be submitting a set of plans and specifications. The landlord may want to send it off to their engineering team for review and comment. And it's a lengthy process. I mean, you know what it's like to do your own internal planning and design and engineering and execution of a construction project. This really adds a whole nother layer to it. So you'll want to make sure that you incorporate an appropriate amount of time into your plan so that the landlord does get its chance to review your documents. And generally speaking, again, there's some language that you'll see in the lease. Consent shall not be unreasonably withheld, conditioned, or delayed. Reasonable versus unreasonable. You'll see all of that in there, which basically means unless you're trying to put a Ferris wheel in an office building, the landlords generally can't say no, right? They should be saying yes as long as you're not doing anything that's unreasonable. Or they can't say, okay, you want to do that. Well, I'm going to want a brand new building at the end. That would be, that would be a unreasonable condition that just doesn't make sense. So, but generally speaking, they have a period of time to approve your documents, your drawings, and specifications. Um, the last part of the slide here is the holdover. And I mentioned that in the beginning, why it's just so important. So for holdover, it's I think one of the most overlooked but expensive parts of the lease. What happens is when a tenant stays in a space after the lease expires, even a short delay, even a day, can trigger steep rent penalties. Many leases are set to have a holdover rent of 150 to 200% of the rent. So if you were paying whatever, $10,000 a month in rent, if you hold over a day, you're going to be going forward paying $20,000 a month in rent. So this becomes an immediate and avoidable expense. The other part of this is there could be damages, right? So if you're in a 10,000 square foot space in a 100,000 square foot building and you're expected to leave at the end of the year, and the tenant has a signed lease with Microsoft, and Microsoft is going to take the entire building for 20 years, as long as the entire building's available. What happens? You don't get out on December 31st, you get out on January 1st. Not that big of a deal, right? It's the holidays, all this. Well, if Microsoft had the deal to be in there January 1st and couldn't get in there because you had not finished moving out, technically, by the letter of the law of the lease, the landlord can hold you responsible for losing that 20-year lease for 100,000 square feet with Microsoft. Now, at the end of the day, does that ever happen? And the lawyers will get involved, and there'll be lots of people getting involved and a lot of hand wringing. But a lot of money will be spent on lawyers fighting all of this on both sides. And it's just because you didn't have your ducks in a row to get out in time can really cause a lot of headaches for the organization. So that's really again with the holdover. You can't stress enough the importance of making sure that you're out of the space when you say you're going to be out of the space. And sometimes even the holdover can be a result of a misunderstanding about what has to be restored at the end of the lease. I mentioned this. So with the alterations and improvements, sorry, no, not that slide yet. With the alterations and improvements, it's really important that when you say, "Hey, I'm building out these 4 offices and a little R&D lab," at that time, working with the landlord to ensure that they know what you expect to take out or what they expect you to take out. Because there are some cases where a landlord, sees some value in what you're putting into the space, and they may agree that although it's different than how they delivered the space, that they may want and actually approve that you keep the space that way. But the other side of it is, generally speaking, the landlord is going to want the space back in the condition, bring a broom clean, that they gave it to you. So even if you put up the 4 offices and the R&D room, and it was the most beautiful offices and most high-tech R&D lab, the landlord may have absolutely no use for that going forward. And so in theory, they're gonna want those things gone at the end. And if they're not gone at the end, and it hasn't been made clear as to whether they should or shouldn't be gone, again, you're looking at potential for holdover. Another very real world case with holdover can be with tell data wiring, right? You put it in, it's up above the ceiling, you forget about it. Everybody seems to forget about it. But it's generally pretty well laid out in the lease that if you put it in, it's got to come out. That includes tell data wiring. And if you think you're out of the space, your furniture's out, you took down the office, you took out the R&D lab, great. That tell data wiring is still in the ceiling. again, depending on the landlord, and I have worked for landlords that have taken tenants to court and held them in holdover, simply because the tell data wiring was not removed or not properly removed from a space. So yeah, communication with the landlord can really help clear up identify what needs to go and clear up any potential issues. Um, So FN responsibility and risk. So even though legal or real estate signs the lease, FM ends up running 70–80% of what's in the lease. So that's why understanding the document matters. Missing a clause can lead to financial penalties or disputes, which we talked about with the holdover in particularly. But if it's done well, the lease does become the playbook that actually protects you and your budget. Um, yeah, was the lease review? Yeah, that's the playbook. So, summary of key takeaways. So, OpEx, review that reconciliation statement that you'll get. Again, it generally comes in March. It'll outline everything that the landlord is doing in the building or even on the campus, depending on how big of a space it is. And it helps you to know what you should and should not be paying for. Again, that then ties to knowing your premises, what is common area and what is not. Um, so maintenance, important to document all of your preventative maintenance to prove that you were in compliance, and knowing who is responsible for maintaining things. Again, you don't want to get to the point at the end of the lease, say, well, I thought you were doing that. Oh, I thought you were doing that. And it turns out nobody was doing it. Now, quite frankly, something like that may get identified well before the end of a lease. But still, you'll want to know that's where the kind of operational surprise comes in, right? It's, oh, I thought you were maintaining that. No, I thought you were maintaining that. Well, if that ends up being your cost, you haven't budgeted for that, repairing that particular piece of equipment, et cetera, that becomes an issue for you. And then approvals, right? Plan for and budget time for the consent process. So you're going to make those modifications. Make sure that you build in the time necessary for the landlord to go through and review your documents. But then also, if you can at that time, understand what needs to be removed at the end of the lease to avoid any holdover situations. Now, I do throw this last bullet point in here. It's okay to use AI. If you, to the extent you can get a full copy of the lease, plugging it into ChatGPT, pick your, Copilot, what have you, plugging it in there can really be a resource. I will say it is not perfect, but it can, the eye chart at the beginning. And I'll be sharing the slides so you can take, use it as a reference. But AI can certainly provide some guidance, but I know from experience that it is not perfect. I was looking at a lease the other day, looking at something, and it was giving me an address that was not in the lease at all. It was a different premises altogether. It was close. I was looking for 6 Bunker Hill, and this was giving me 6 Black Falcon. I cannot explain where that came from because it was not, those were not words in the document I was looking at. So we can use AI as a tool, and AI is an amazing tool for looking at leases, but it's definitely not 100% perfect. And so with that, we can go to Q&A, and hopefully I can. You found that that presentation somewhat helpful. I know it was a quick overview. Again, people spend their whole lives just dealing with certain sections of these leases, much less 40 minutes on an entire lease. So,
I did see,
is there
Rob, that
any specific questions?
there were a couple comments in the chat. I think someone brought up union information and then use of Wi-Fi. So if you want, I think that was Mike Skiotis from Cognex.
So, what's I'm not seeing the chat, so I don't see it specifically. So, but what's the specific question
Rob,
for?
Hi, Rob. This is Mike Skiotis.
Am I?
I was just sort of lessons learned on it's better if you know ahead of time when you're leasing the building if it's a union building, a non-union building, right? Because it's really going to affect your expenses. Especially we had one at move out that was double what we thought to move and restore the building because it was a union building and nobody, we leased it not even knowing it was everything had to be done union. So it was a big
Yeah.
cost there. And then when you were talking about the pulling out the wires, we have a lot of engineering, but we've greatly reduced the number of cables we use now and try to rely on Wi-Fi access. We might have to for some engineering. We do a lot of switches, so you're not paying for pulling the cable in and then pulling it back out again.
Yeah. Yeah, the cable, right, there I could even see a point in the future where, the cabling becomes a moot point where everything is done via a Wi-Fi or something. But it is, we're not there yet, and there certainly is a lot of cables going through the building. So yeah, no, that's true. And the things, where it comes to the union, that's a good point, Mike. It may not always be clear exactly what type of labor you would need to use. Sometimes that might be in the building. Rules and regs. Sometimes it might be as part of that landlord review, right? You can do X, Y, and Z, and you must use union labor. So, it hopefully is not a surprise. But if you're not finding it anywhere in the lease or in the rules and regs, it definitely should be and can be a question to the landlord.
And another question I typically do is if we going to own maintenance on HVAC equipment, getting a list beforehand and ages and serial numbers and stuff, so we're not inheriting something at end of life and then during the lease they're making us replace it, or we didn't maintain it and it's 18 years old or something.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a very real world example as well, Mike. Thanks. Yeah, landlords will do that. Again, not to say they're being malicious, but they know the age of their equipment, and depending on ownership, right? I mean, some of these buildings they trade every 5 to 7 years, and if over the course of the 35-year life of a building, 3, 4, 5 owners, that documentation could be long gone. So in some fairness to landlords, they don't always know what they've got. But yeah, as an FM, to the extent you can get that information, so you know what you're dealing with. Um, and the repair and maintenance can also speak to that, right? It's you may be responsible for repairs, but replacements are not something you're going to be responsible for. And again, that can be detailed in the lease. And as long as you have the records to say like, hey, I've been doing my monthlies, quarterlies, everything, and this thing's still broken, and you knew it was a piece of junk when I first got it. You know, generally speaking, you've got a leg to stand on as long as it's well defined in the lease, the distinction between the repair and the replacement.
We've had a couple times where we reached out to the landlord. It was a big lease, and there was some risk with the equipment. And we were allowed to do a pre-inspection with our own mechanical contractor to go through everything there and give us a thumbs up or anything that we should worry about it and negotiate.
Yeah, landlords hate that.
Oh, I know. We love it
They
though.
don't, they don't want because you're going to go and say, "Oh, this is all a piece of junk," and I want a whole bunch of TI to replace it, right? And those conversations happen. Again, you're probably in many cases you're feeding up information to whatever your CFO, your director of real estate, whoever it is, and the sausage gets made somewhere else. But yeah, it's important for the FM to really be honest with whomever it is in your organization that's the money to let them know what you're inheriting in that lease. Gio, you mentioned there's some other comments
I
or
think those, I think,
questions in
let me
chat.
just check. I think those were the two that I saw. The deck will be shared. I don't know if everybody
Yeah.
saw that. We will share the deck after this. The union, and yeah, nope, those were the only things that I've seen so far. So if there are other questions that people have or comments, experiences that you've had with leases, now's the time to chat about it.
Rob, I have one question sort of
Sure.
related to the lease. How does your organization work with your finance team to put a dollar value on the restoration, right? So we need to supply that information globally for any of our leases, and they'll say, how much is this going to cost us at the end of the lease because they got to carry that cost. How do you handle that?
So yeah, it's going to vary from organization to organization depending on how sophisticated they are. lot of the time you might just be bringing in, a GC to take a look and, represent you as the landlord and say, "Hey, I think it's going to be this." Sometimes you have a in-house, construction group that's going to know these things. So it really, in my experience, there's not a uniform way in which that value is derived from one side or the other. What I can say, my experience is there is a lot of sausage. There's a lot of negotiation there at the end of the day in terms of what that number is going to be. A lot of back and forth between both parties. Right, like even signage on the exterior of a building. It's generally very clear that people are removing that. When I say people, tenants are removing that. Sometimes tenants are sometimes in a financial position where they don't have that money, and so the landlord, okay, I'll do that, but then I'm not going to give you as much security deposit back, or you get rid of the sign, I'll let you keep those offices that you put in there even though I don't really want them. So at the end of a lease, there's a lot in my experience, both with kind of smaller local landlords, but even then some of the larger, more sophisticated ones, there ends up being a lot of horse trading there.
I find sometimes you got to educate the executives because, let's downsize this space or move out of this space to a smaller space and to realize the cost of it, right? The cost of
Yeah.
getting out and restoration could be eat into your whole savings to, go from
Yeah.
10,000 feet to 5,000 feet.
Yeah, I mean, right, demising, right? The cost of demise of space, right? Oh, yeah, let's put a wall up here and we'll stay in this side and we'll give that side back to the landlord. It's never that easy.
Yep.
So does that
Any
wrap
other
it up?
questions out there? Or
Anyone,
real
if
world
if anybody has like
experiences?
specific experiences, yeah, that they don't necessarily want to share. I don't know how many. I don't see how many people are on the call. Right, it's 17. Uh, but yeah, if anybody has any other real world examples that they don't necessarily want to share, but just kind of pick my brain about, hey, have you ever seen this, or what do you think about that? Happy to take it offline and let you know what I think. Great.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Rob.
All right.
That
Thank
was,
you.
we've
Thanks,
gotten
Rob.
some great comments already
Yep.
down there. If you didn't see them, people said, thank you very much. Job well done. Really
Yep.
appreciate it. So I think IFMA Boston would say the same, or, thank you from all of the leadership. And I'll turn it back over to
Great.
Michelle.
Thank you so much, Rob. I think this was really great. Some of the things that we deal with and don't think about until it's too late. So, thank you all again for joining us today. If you're not a member of IFMA Boston, we hope that you found today's program valuable and that you will consider joining our chapter. You can find more information on the website at ifmaboston.org or reach out to geo@ifmaboston.org for any information. You're also welcome to reach out to Matt or Rob or myself. We're always happy to chat with anybody too. So, but thank you guys for joining us today. We hope we'll see you on Tuesday to talk about snow, and also for the open mic night in March. Look for that invite as well. Thank you guys.
Have a great rest of your day.
Bye,
Rob.
You.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.